Today's discussion will be presented in three sections since we are recording the session for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to get them answered online. We are particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Jason Miller, the executive editor of Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Let me turn over the reins to Jason to begin today's discussion.
Welcome and thanks for joining our special discussion in recognition of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I'm Jason Miller, your host. Our guests today are Barron-DiCamillo, the Director of US-CERT at the Homeland Security Department, Bill Lay, the Deputy Chief Information Officer for Information Assurance and Information Security Officer at the Department of State, Dr. Ron Ross, a Fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and later in today's conversation, we'll be speaking with Eddie Garcia, the Chief Security Architect in the Office of the CTO for Cloudera. So before we get started, welcome to the panel. Let me set a little context for our discussion. For almost a decade, cybersecurity community has talked about data. It's all about the data. The systems, the networks, the hardware devices, yes, they're important. But if you can secure the data, you really are protecting your organization's most important assets, beyond the people, of course. Many organizations, agencies, private sector spend most of their time and resources on cybersecurity. Recent data breaches at OPM, Target, JP Morgan Chase, and a host of others really beg us to ask the question, are agencies, our organizations, our companies really focusing on the wrong issues? Is it cybersecurity? Is it data security? What are we supposed to be focusing on? If you look at legislation, almost all of them say information security, whether it's the Federal Information Security Management Act or the Cyber Information Sharing Protection Act or a host of other bills. The key word each of those bills is information security. Then what is cybersecurity and how does it relate to data security? Some say cybersecurity is about behaviors and activity, while data security is about information. Other experts say cybersecurity has been viewed as a means to an end or a means to data security, but can the reverse also be true? When we talk about data security, what should agencies focus on? How does data hygiene, data analytics, and other data security approaches really apply to this? We're going to try to answer those questions and probably many more in our panel discussion today. Once again, our guests today, Barron-DiCamillo, the Director of US-CERT at the Homeland Security Department, Bill Lay, the Deputy Chief Information Officer for Information Assurance and the Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of State, Dr. Ron Ross, a Fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and later in our conversation, we'll be speaking with Eddie Garcia, the Chief Security Architect in the Office of the CTO for Cloudera. Let's start with some basics. In my intro, I talked a lot about the viewpoint of cybersecurity versus data security. I'm going to go to Ron. You get the joy of writing the 853 document, among other things, of writness. Are we focusing on the wrong things? Our agencies, our companies, is there a difference between data security and cybersecurity?
I think that you can find differences in the definitions, but I think they're very much related. I've never been able to separate information security from the actual system where that information is processed, stored, and transmitted. So when we talk about protecting information, it has to be the case that you have to protect the system where that information lives. And so when you talk about behavior versus information, it's always been about processes, people, and technologies. It's kind of there's a three-pronged effort that we have to do to make sure that data and information is properly secured. But I think the thing we've been missing is it's always tied back to the mission of the organization. Every organization has a different mission or business set of operations, and information has value to those operations and those missions. And the value of the information, that the ability to protect that is a direct impact on whether they can carry out those missions and business operations successfully. So I think it's all part of the same discussion.
Bill, let's look at it from an operational perspective in many ways. At the State Department, you guys are living what Ron is kind of describing. Talk a little bit about how you view the difference between data security, cybersecurity, and how they're interrelated.
Well, I agree with Dr. Ross. It's very difficult to separate. You have to take a full spectrum approach. It's not just focused on the technology. It's not just focused on, is your data secure? The people portion is huge, especially with our attack vectors changing. The skill sets are always maturing and becoming obsolete. It's a moving target for all of us. The goal for IT is to enable an organization, in our case is a federal agency or department, to do its mission. We're there because of the mission. The mission's not there because of the IT. And cybersecurity is an enabler. If we can provide security so that mission can be carried out in a efficient, secure, timely manner, then we're doing our jobs and upholding our part of the bargain.
Now, and at US-CERT, you guys are all about the data. All the data that comes to US-CERT from agencies, data comes from the private sector. But is there, when you look at cybersecurity, data security, is there a difference for you guys?
Definitely. I think the last 24 months of the data breaches and the increased attention we've seen from data breaches, I think we're seeing the attack surface is growing daily. It's not practical or effective for federal agencies to continually widen their security net and attempt to protect everything. As Michael Daniel, the President's Cybersecurity Coordinator, recently said at a conference last week, we can't protect everything. Instead, we must protect what matters most, such as personally identified information and other sensitive data. So I think from an incident response perspective, we're really seeing a shift across departments and agencies, critical infrastructure partners, state, local, tribal, territorial partners, and international constituents to really focus on what matters most. Identify your high-value assets within your networks and ensure that those get the priority protections, because it's such a large attack surface that we're all trying to focus on with limited resources, with not enough skilled practitioners doing this job.
And really what she's talking about, Ron, is that idea of risk management, almost what you were describing in the front end of our conversation when you say the data security, the cybersecurity are intertwined, and they just have to kind of make the people decision about the mission area. Talk a little bit about that risk-based approach. I know, obviously, the NIST documents really do focus on risk.
Well, risk management is very difficult to begin with, but it really is predicated on having the right stakeholders weighing in to manage that risk. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that there's a lot of outsourcing within agencies, outsourcing within the agency, where the CIO, because the CISO has been hardwired under the Chief Information Officer, and sometimes the mission business owners, who actually are the ones that take the risks in whatever the system that's supporting whatever mission, they're not always directly involved in these decisions. And so I think from the security perspective, we've kind of come to this view where security is binary. Either you're trying to secure the system or it's insecure. And it's usually a gray area in between, because risk management involves decisions. And as you were saying before, you can't always protect everything, so you've got to go to those high-value assets and focus there. And so in some sense, I was listening to Chris Inglis, who's the former deputy director of NSA not too long ago, and he described the problem perfectly. He said, when the military goes to build an aircraft, there are two ends of the spectrum for stability. I can have a perfectly stable aircraft or unstable. The perfectly stable aircraft won't fly, and the perfectly unstable aircraft is going to have problems. Now, when you put a pilot as a stakeholder into that perspective, pilots value maneuverability, because they're trying to, in air-to-air combat, they're trying to win. So when you engineer and design an aircraft, you're going to balance the stability and the maneuverability. And information security is exactly the same thing. We have to understand that it's not going to be a black and white issue. It's going to be tied to an engineering process where we are making those decisions based on the value of the assets, how much we need to protect or invest in protecting those assets, and that is really that decision part of the process really is predicated on having the right stakeholders at the table. And I think that's sometimes where we kind of go off the track a little bit.
I love the fact you talked about security is binary. People too often, and we're going to pick on the auditors, not that you guys want to pick on the auditors, but too often the auditors look at it as a black and white issue. Exactly. I heard a great story the other day about someone getting dinged for cloud email because it didn't have a COOP plan, and the response was, well, if this cloud provider, global cloud provider goes down, we have bigger problems than my simple COOP email. So, Bill, how do you find that right balance? How do you ensure the stakeholders are part of that discussion?
It's all about education and information. It's making sure that through our processes, whether it's FISMA or what we're doing with continuous diagnostics and mitigation, or how we implement the risk management framework at the department, that people do have good, solid, timely information to make risk-based decisions. And a lot of times that's educating business owners into what it means to be a true data steward. In some cases, you really have to expand their horizon so they understand that the decisions they make relative to the data or information that they own or preserve has wide-ranging consequences. It can affect other agencies, in our case at state, it could affect other governments. And so it really trying to encapsulate that into information where people get what you're trying to convey to them, is that can be the big challenge.
Do you get the sense that with all these breaches that have happened over the last 18 months or so, that the mission owners are better educated about what this means to make a risk-based decision?
Absolutely, and I would attribute the recent OMB 30-day sprint to really elevating the conversation. When we have secretaries of cabinet-level departments having conversations about cybersecurity, they've got a lot on their plate, so that's a big deal.
And from your perspective, when US-CERT is talking with agencies, working with them, you guys, for instance, get called in quite often to help agencies when they have a breach, think they have a breach, to help deal with their systems. Are they bringing in the mission partners to be part of that discussion when there is potentially a problem?
You touched on a really important point I wanted to make. A lot of times departments and agencies don't have an incident response plan, which would help them identify those critical stakeholder partners, mission partners. And so a lot of times when we're called in for an event, sad to say, the one thing we ask for is, what is your incident response plan? And a lot of times we get a kind of a blank look or a question, or, oh, let's go find something that was written 5 years ago that's out of date. All the contexts within that plan are out of date. And so one of the things we're continuing to try to educate the community is the importance of having an up-to-date incident response plan, knowing who your mission partners and stakeholders are, knowing who's responsible for all the aspects of your network, so that if you need to segment a portion or take a portion offline for a period of time, or even make sure you have data replication being done separately, or that the fact that you don't want certain logs to be written over while you're going through an investigation, all of those questions are going to be what my team's going to ask. And a lot of times they don't have the right resources on hand to make a quick decision, and it delays the timeliness of a response. So I would say some departments and agencies are doing much better at this, but across the constituency in general, the plans they have are a lot of times just out of date. So the importance of ensuring that you have a plan and that it's up to date with all the right mission stakeholders is paramount.
And I'm going to do a little self-promotion here. We had a great interview just about a month ago about do's and don'ts in the wake of a cybersecurity incident, and this came up exactly. Mm-hmm. So we'll make sure we link up on federalnewsradio.com for that. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to the panel discussion, Cybersecurity versus Data Security, Government's Two-Pronged Challenge, sponsored by Cloudera, on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.